Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question now is that Vote Defence Force stand part of the schedule.
Mr. Chairman.
I call the Honourable Philip Goff.
Mr. Chairman, every day in this House, as we look around the walls and the plaques that are displayed there, we can feel and take pride in the courage and the achievements of the New Zealand Defence Force. It's therefore with enormous sorrow that I witnessed at the estimates hearing on defence the enormous damage that has been inflicted on the New Zealand Defence Force by this national government. Damage that was never promised at the 2008 election. I remember the campaign where the National Party was saying that they would strengthen the New Zealand Defence Force. They've done exactly the opposite. They've cut its funding, they've weakened it, they've demoralised it, and people have left in their droves. And that, sir, is a real shame. What we found, though the Minister denied it, was actually in one of his answers to a written question, is that the real operating expenditure on New Zealand Defence has been cut this year. They have cut the operating expenditure for defence. The Army and the Navy have had $100 million taken out of it. That's not chicken feed. $100 million from the Army and the Navy. $63 million cut in salary payments. And you know how they got the salary payments, Mr. Chairman? They got it by cutting the New Zealand Defence Force by 1,269 personnel since they became government. Never promised that at the 2008 election. They have cut the Defence Force and they have reduced the capacity of that Defence Force to act on our behalf. Now, the Minister in the chair denied that last year, and he denied it again this year, but then I've got the actual transcript from the Select Committee hearing, because this is what the Chief of Defence Force says. We're accepting that loss of people does degrade capability. That's what Rhys Jones said. He fronted up and admitted what the Minister wouldn't, that the cuts have degraded the capability of the New Zealand Defence Force. And it's not just even across the board. Anyone that's served in the military here knows that the vital ranks in the military are at the NCO level. You know, the first lieutenant always depends on the sergeant. It goes back a long time in history. It's the warrant officer. You know, Minister, at the warrant officer level, the attrition has increased fivefold since your party assumed government. Fivefold attrition at a warrant officer level. It takes 15 years for somebody to get to that level and develop the skill and the experience they need. And that is what this government has done. You know, in 1 year, they increased the attrition of the New Zealand Defence Force from 8% to 21%. Between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 in that year alone left the New Zealand Defence Force. A level of attrition never seen before. You know, to misquote Churchill, never in the history of the New Zealand Defence Force have so many people left in such a short period of time. And that has damaged our Defence Force, Mr. Speaker. And when we look at what the Auditor-General said about that, forget the party politics, let's have a look at what the Auditor-General says about that, because she put out a report in the last year. And she said the government has damaged the bonds of camaraderie, integrity and commitment that are part of the New Zealand Defence Force. Damaged those bonds. She said that the government has chosen a course that led to a drop of morale and an increase in attrition, resulting in reduced capability. Chief of Defence Force says there's reduced capability. The Auditor-General says there's reduced capability, and the Minister says, no, it hasn't affected what they can do. Who do you believe, Mr. Chairman? Do you believe the Chief of Defence Force, or do you believe the Minister of Defence making excuses for his government's own inadequacy? Mr. Speaker, what the Auditor-General said was that civilianisation had been a disaster. She said that actually people were treated in a way that was almost a calculated insult. You know, the people that were being made redundant got letters, and those letters, I won't take the time, but I've got them here, I can table them if you want to read them. They told people who were being dumped from the Defence Force to save money that they were being dumped because they lacked commitment, they didn't have potential, and they weren't as good as their peers. That's what it said in blunt terms. The Defence Force hung its head in shame and said, yes, we told good people they were bad. So, Minister, you have made hundreds of people redundant, and you have told them through the Defence Force that it was their own fault because they lack commitment and they lack potential. Come down to the RSA and talk to some of the people that have served for 10, 20 years who have been made redundant, and your Defence Force leadership said that they were being made redundant, Mr Chairman.
The Honourable.
They were being made redundant because they lacked commitment. These are people that have given their lives to New Zealand, and that was the loyalty that was reciprocated to them. I want to say, Mr Speaker, that when you put the Defence Force under pressure, that puts lives at risk and well-being at risk. And I want to draw on the Court of Inquiry into the death of Corporal Doug Hughes. You know what that Court of Inquiry told us? You only know this because I'm telling you, because the government won't release the Court of Inquiry. The family, the Hughes family wants it released, but the government won't release it. Mr Speaker, you know what it said? It said they cut the deployment from the pre-deployment training going into Afghanistan from 5 to 3 weeks. Outcomes were not achieved. They rushed through things like stress management and stress identification. They said the commanding officer and the warrant officer weren't confident that they were adequately trained, but they had no choice but to deploy them. They said that the deployment went on for 2 months longer than it should have, and the people were exhausted at the end. They said that the forward operating base at Romero didn't have enough defibrillators so that if there were mass casualties, they wouldn't have been able to cope. And the Minister won't admit to those things. You know what they did at the Select Committee, Mr Chairman, was really interesting. They got poor Colonel Brett Wellington, who was the commanding officer of that crib, up on the stand to try to rebut what I was saying. But I've got the transcript in my hand as to what he said. Here it is. Wellington, Colonel Wellington, I believe the pre-deployment training was reduced, and it did put pressure on us in respect to achieving the competencies that we would ordinarily achieve before deploying overseas. I asked him if he was misquoted in the Court of Inquiry. He said no. We had Jerry Brownlee in this House speaking on behalf of the Minister that said I was wrong. Here is the commander of the crib at the Select Committee saying exactly what he thought. And I asked him about the risk of the longer deployment, and he said, yes, me and my commanders had to manage that risk, and we did that in several ways. I asked him if he was right, if the Court of Inquiry was right about the Romero operating base, and he said, quote, absolutely, we would have been challenged if we had mass casualties. Is that good enough, Minister? Is it good enough when we put the lives of our people serving our country at risk in Afghanistan that you cut corners? And they cut corners, and that Court of Inquiry said it, and that's why the government continues to suppress it, Mr Speaker. I want to go on to another aspect of another Court of Inquiry and the impact of low morale and high attrition, because that does create greater potential for mistakes, mishaps, and things not being done well. Private Michael Ross died in the lake near Waihuru last year, and the Court of Inquiry in this case was released. It said it wasn't a freak accident. It wasn't even an accident caused by a couple of errors. It was an accident that was absolutely avoidable, and it listed the things that the Defence Force weren't doing well that led to his death. 12 different things, Minister. 12 different causes. You have a life jacket where the canister's empty and it doesn't deflate when you're carrying a mini machine gun, and it drags you to the bottom. The life jackets weren't fit for purpose. They'd never been trained in the use of the life jackets. The boat wasn't inflated properly, and that caused the accident. The safety boat wasn't alongside it, and when it turned up, it had one person, not 3 people. 12 major errors. This is a sign, Minister, of a Defence Force that is dysfunctional, and it's dysfunctional because of the pressure that this government has put on it, and that is a disgrace. I'm really proud of the men and women that serve in our Defence Force, but they are not being treated well. Their loyalty to New Zealand is not being reciprocated by the government's loyalty to its men and women in uniform. And that, Mr Chairman, simply isn't good enough. And I want to finish on this point, Mr Chairman. When it came out that in the Defence Operating Manual over the weekend it said that you were subversive if you brought the government into disrepute, I guess I've just been subversive, Mr Chairman. And worse still, it said that journalists were subversive because it did that. How did the Minister respond? First of all, he wouldn't front up. And when he did front up, and I heard him on Checkpoint, he wanted to know who'd leaked the document. He didn't want to know, he didn't express outrage that this document, that's been around for a number of years, had that clause in it. He wanted to know who leaked it. And I say the person who leaked it did this country a favour.
The Honourable Minister, Jonathan.
Well, Mr Chair, I feel